Warsaw Ghetto Uprising has made an impact on the modern world by having a legacy of Jewish armed resistance. Even today, the State of Israel responds to every threat and is not afraid to fight back because of the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We start off our epic story of rebellion in Poland in 1942 at the Warsaw Ghetto. This ghetto was very important because it had an uprising that showed incredible strength, unity, bravery, and intelligence. In 1942, Hitler ordered for all Jews to be rounded up and deported to death camps. In April 1942, the Jews left in the ghetto found out and made a military organization called ZOB and prepared to fight. In January 1943, the first fight broke out between the German troops and the Jewish fighters. Then in April 19th of that year, the uprising officially began. Weeks later, on May 8th, the Germans took ZOB headquarters. And finally on May 16th, the fighting officially ended. The Warsaw Ghetto is a perfect example of breaking barriers because it shows Jewish people's fight against oppression. The Jews broke the German-imposed barrier by smuggling food in, creating schools and libraries, and continuing religious practices inside the Warsaw Ghetto. Their greatest act of breaking barriers was the armed uprising at the Warsaw Ghetto. Smuggling was a huge part in the ghetto since they had to live on 6.5 ounces of bread a day, 35.3 ounces of sugar a month, and 18 ounces of honey. It was calculated that rations given out didn't cover 10% of normal requirements. If the Jews only ate what the Nazis had given them, then the entire population in the ghetto would have died from starvation in a very, very short time. The Germans did everything in their power to try and make sure no food got in. They had a big wall around the ghetto. When that didn't work, they added barbed wire and broken glass to the walls. Finally, the Germans were ordered to make the wall higher and added many more guards. When they found these smugglers, they shot them on sight. Almost all of the smugglers were young children about 5 or 6 since they were small enough to fit into tiny spaces and were quick enough to have a chance to get away from the guards. Smuggling was always happening and they used candles to signal when it was clear for the smugglers to head out. They smuggled food through walls, gates, underground tunnels, through sewers, and through the buildings near the walls. Despite having the threat of extreme punishment or death for building schools, libraries, teaching children still, and continuing to celebrate religious holidays and practice religious acts, they still did it. Since schooling was not permitted by the Nazis, the Jews built schools in underground bunkers or used buildings. To make sure the Nazis didn't know they were teaching the kids, and they disguised the lessons as games or plays when the guards came by. Because Hitler wanted all Hebrew and Yiddish libraries to be destroyed, Jews sneaked in books into underground bunkers. They made book catalogs, they had secret codes to protect library members, and they created a system of lending books by having young volunteers deliver books and get orders for other books. Most volunteers were killed on the spot or tortured to death. Despite the risks and consequences of death and torture, many people still volunteered and the underground libraries ran until the very end. Hitler also wanted all synagogues to be destroyed, so the Jews made underground synagogues in the bunkers. And they had Shabbat services and celebrated Jewish holidays. In 1942, Hitler decided to start the liquidation and deportation of the Jews to death camps. The Germans ordered people for deportation. About 300,000 men, women, and children were sent to Treblinka, a death camp where all of them were murdered. Between 55,000 and 60,000 were left in Warsaw. In April 1942, the Jews learned that the Germans planned to deport all the remaining survivors to Treblinka. Once they found this out, a group of teenagers and young adults from ZOB, Jewish Fighting Organization, led by 23-year-old Mordecai Anielewicz, began to plan for an armed resistance. In January 1943, Jewish fighters attacked German troops as they tried to gather up another group of Jews for deportation. The fighters used a very small supply of weapons, mainly guns, that had been smuggled in. After a couple of days, the German troops retreated, and the victory gave hope and inspired the fighters to plan future fights, train more, and smuggle in more weapons. On the morning of April 19, 1943, the uprising began when German troops and police entered the ghetto and tried to deport the last survivors. The 750 fighters had a small number of pistols and 17 rifles while facing more than 2,000 heavily armed professional German troops who had tanks and flamethrowers. The Germans had to withdraw, but they returned the next day with more weapons and still couldn't defeat the Jews. After many days of fighting, the commander, General Jürgen Stroop, ordered the ghetto to be burned down. Despite this, the Jews held off the German troops for 27 days. On May 8, the headquarters of ZOB was captured. Mordecai and most of his followers were killed in the fighting, but some escaped through the sewers. On May 16, Stroop announced the fighting officially ended. About 300 Germans and 7,000 Jews were killed in the uprising, and the rest of the Jews were deported to Treblinka. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising is an example of breaking barriers because it broke social and physical barriers. It broke social barriers by having Jews making secret libraries and schools, building underground synagogues, and showed how brave and strong they were. And it broke physical barriers by the smugglers finding all sorts of ways to get outside and get food, the battle between the German troops and the Jewish resistance fighters, and the burning down of the ghetto. Even though they lost the battle, the uprising gave hope to everyone during this dark time. The uprising helped show people that the Jews didn't just give up and submit to the abuse and eventually their fate. It showed that they wouldn't go down without a fight and would still celebrate their culture and faith even with the threat of horrible death.